What if the golden age of Athens wasn't built on democracy as we know it? What if the man who perfected Greek government was actually accused of being a tyrant? And what if the system he created contained secrets about power that modern democracies have completely forgotten? Welcome. Today, we're exploring one of history's most misunderstood figures, Pericles of Athens. You've been told he was a champion of democracy, that he represented the people's will. But here's what the textbooks don't mention. This man held power for over 30 years in a system designed to prevent anyone from holding power that long. They don't explain how he transformed Athens from a modest city-state into an empire while claiming to serve democratic ideals. They skip over the radical techniques he used to reshape reality itself. Let's dive into what really happened during Athens' most mysterious golden age. The year is 495 BC. Pericles is born into one of Athens' most powerful families. His father, Xanthippus, commanded the Greek fleet that defeated the Persians. His mother's family claimed descent from ancient kings. This wasn't some commoner rising through democracy. This was aristocratic power learning to wear a democratic mask. But here's where the story gets interesting. In 472 BC, when Pericles is just 23 years old, something unusual happens. His mentor, a philosopher named Anaxagoras, arrives in Athens teaching radical ideas about the nature of reality. Anaxagoras claims that the sun isn't a god but a burning stone larger than the entire Peloponnese. He teaches that everything in the universe is made of tiny seeds, that mind organizes matter, that the gods might not control everything after all. Think about what this means in ancient Athens. Religion and politics are inseparable. The state is protected by gods. Oracles determine military strategy. And here's a young aristocrat learning that reality might work completely differently than everyone believes. Ancient sources, particularly Plutarch's Biography, written 500 years later but based on contemporary accounts, describe how Pericles studied not just philosophy, but rhetoric, the art of persuasion. He learned from teachers who understood that controlling language means controlling thought, that framing debates determines their outcomes before they even begin. Archaeological evidence from the Athenian agora, excavated between 1968 and 1984, reveals something fascinating about this period. Inscriptions show a dramatic increase in public participation in government, but also a centralization of actual decision-making. More people voting, but fewer people actually setting the agenda. What exactly was Pericles doing during these formative years? What techniques was he developing that would let him dominate Athenian politics for 3 decades? To understand how Pericles transformed democracy, we need to understand the revolutionary worldview he was building. Traditional Athenian politics worked through aristocratic families competing for influence. You won by being the best warrior, the most generous patron, the man with the oldest bloodline. But Pericles was developing something different, a system where you won by appearing to serve the people while actually directing their will. This wasn't cynical manipulation. It was something more sophisticated. Pericles genuinely believed in the potential of Athenian citizens to govern themselves. But he also believed they needed guidance, education, shaping. Like a sculptor working with marble, he would work with public opinion, revealing the form hidden inside the raw material. His philosophical training gave him unique tools. From Anaxagoras, he learned that natural law, not divine whim, governed the universe. This meant politics could be understood as a science, not just an art. Patterns could be identified. Outcomes could be predicted. Systems could be designed. Imagine seeing democracy not as a sacred tradition, but as a technology that could be refined. The Athenian assembly met on a hill called the Pnyx, where citizens gathered to vote on laws and policies. But who decided what came to a vote? Who framed the questions? Who spoke first and set the terms of debate? These weren't random, they were leverage points where small interventions could shift massive outcomes. Pericles also studied something the Greeks called kairos, the right moment. Not just what to say, but when to say it. Not just what policy to propose, but when the city would be ready to accept it. Modern psychology calls this framing effects and priming the understanding that context determines interpretation, that the order of information shapes conclusion. Some scholars believe Pericles developed what we might call democratic engineering, the practice of designing systems that produce desired outcomes while appearing completely open and free. You don't force people to agree with you. You create conditions where your solution becomes the obvious answer. Ancient sources describe his speaking style as unique. Unlike other politicians who used dramatic gestures and emotional appeals, Pericles spoke calmly, logically, with mathematical precision. Plutarch writes that he was called the Olympian because he seemed to thunder and lightning from the speaker's platform. But this wasn't volume, it was clarity so powerful it felt like a force of nature. Think about it, while other politicians were trying to win arguments, Pericles was redesigning how arguments themselves worked. He wasn't just playing the game. He was rewriting the rules while everyone else was still learning to play. But Pericles wasn't just developing philosophical theories. He was building the physical infrastructure of power. In 463 BC, he proposed something revolutionary, paying citizens to serve on juries and in government positions. This seems like simple populism, but archaeological analysis of Athenian financial records reveals something more sophisticated. By paying for participation, Pericles made it possible for working-class citizens to engage in politics. But he also made them dependent on the system continuing. Modern political scientists recognize this as institutional capture, making people invested in maintaining the structures that support them. If democracy pays your salary, you defend democracy. If public building projects employ your neighbors, you support public building projects. And Pericles built constantly. The Parthenon, begun in 447 BC, wasn't just a temple. It was a massive employment program, a statement of Athenian power, a physical embodiment of democratic ideals, and a demonstration that Pericles could mobilize resources on an unprecedented scale. Recent studies using laser scanning technology, published in 2019, reveal that Parthenon's proportions follow sophisticated mathematical ratios designed to create psychological responses in viewers. He also restructured Athens' military organization. Instead of relying on wealthy citizens providing their own equipment, he built the state's naval power. Athens' fleet of 300 warships required 30,000 rowers, all citizens, all paid, all dependent on the policies Pericles advocated. Modern military historians recognize this as strategic demographic alignment, making your political base and your military power the same population. Pericles even controlled the physical space of politics. He reorganized where the assembly met, how speakers were positioned, how votes were counted. Every detail was optimized for the outcomes he sought. Now we reach the most fascinating aspect of Pericles' system, the mental and psychological techniques he used to maintain power without appearing to seek it. Ancient historians record that Pericles almost never appeared in public, except for official business. While other politicians constantly circulated at dinner parties and social events, building personal relationships and trading favors, Pericles remained deliberately distant. Why? Because scarcity creates value. By appearing rarely, his appearances became significant events. He also mastered something the Greeks called fearless speech, the courage to tell uncomfortable truths. But here's the sophisticated part: he told truths that made people feel elevated for hearing them. His famous funeral oration, delivered in 431 BC during the Peloponnesian War, is a masterpiece of this technique. He doesn't just praise Athens, he articulates Athenian values so perfectly that citizens feel proud to be Athenian, feel that their sacrifices serve something magnificent. Modern rhetorical analysis of this speech, conducted by scholars at Cambridge in 2007, reveals complex patterns of repetition, rhythm, and emotional building. Pericles uses a technique called progressive amplification, starting with simple statements and building to grand visions, carrying the audience along step by step, until they've accepted conclusions they would have rejected if presented bluntly. But here's where it gets really interesting. Pericles also practiced something we might call strategic delegation of authority. He didn't personally propose every measure he wanted passed. Instead, he cultivated relationships with other politicians who would introduce proposals, creating the appearance of broad support. Ancient sources describe how he maintained a network of allies who seemed independent but actually coordinated their actions. Could this be an early form of what modern political scientists call agenda control, not just winning votes, but determining what gets voted on? Many historians now believe Pericles invented techniques that wouldn't be formally theorized until 2,000 years later. He also understood symbolic politics. When Athens' treasury was moved from the island of Delos to Athens itself in 454 BC, it wasn't just about security. It was about making Athens visibly the center of the Greek world. The Panathenaic festival, which Pericles expanded dramatically, brought people from across the Mediterranean to Athens to witness its power and culture. These visitors returned home carrying stories of Athenian magnificence. Thucydides, the historian who lived through this period, wrote something remarkable about Pericles. Athens was in theory a democracy, but in practice was ruled by its first citizen. This wasn't dictatorship. It was something more subtle: leadership so effective that it seemed inevitable, power so widely accepted it became invisible. Think about the psychology required to achieve this. Pericles had to simultaneously convince the masses they held power while actually directing that power himself. He had to appear selfless while accumulating influence. He had to seem like just another citizen while being irreplaceable. Some scholars call this hegemonic leadership domination through consent, where people choose to follow not because they must, but because they believe it's their own decision. Could Pericles have perfected a form of power more absolute than tyranny precisely because it didn't look like power at all? And then we come to the moment that reveals the true genius and danger of Pericles' system. The year is 432 BC. Athens has built an empire of over 200 city-states, all paying tribute. Pericles has held dominant influence for nearly 30 years. And then Sparta, Athens' rival, issues an ultimatum: give the city-states their freedom or face war. But here's what most people don't understand about what happened next. Pericles stands before the Athenian assembly and delivers a speech that will determine the course of Western civilization. He doesn't appeal to emotion. He doesn't rant about Spartan aggression. Instead, he presents a rational calculation: Athens has financial reserves of 6,000 talents of silver. Athens controls the sea. Athens can import food while Sparta cannot sustain a long war. The path to victory is clear: retreat behind Athens' walls, avoid land battles, use naval power to exhaust the enemy. The assembly votes for war. not because they're angry or afraid, but because Pericles has made war seem logical, inevitable, even prudent. Think about what he's done. He's convinced a democracy to embark on a decades-long conflict based on mathematical projections. He's made strategy override emotion, calculation override caution. Ancient sources report that some citizens questioned this policy, but Pericles' authority was so complete that opposition seemed foolish. And here's where the story takes a dark turn. In 430 BC, 1 year into the war, plague strikes Athens. The walls that protected the city become a trap. Thousands die. The population that Pericles crowded inside the fortifications for strategic advantage becomes a concentrated target for disease. Modern epidemiologists estimate Athens lost 1/3 of its population. The assembly turns on Pericles. They fine him for mismanaging the war. For the first time in 3 decades, his authority cracks. But and this is remarkable, within months, they re-elect him as general. Even in failure, even after catastrophic miscalculation, his grip on Athenian politics remains. Recent historical analysis published in 2016 suggests something disturbing. Pericles may have understood the plague risk. Contemporary sources indicate some advisors warned about concentrating population during summer months. But the strategic plan required it, and Pericles valued long-term victory over short-term safety. This raises profound questions. Was Pericles a visionary leader or a calculating manipulator? Did he serve democracy, or did he use democratic forms to pursue personal vision? The ancient sources are conflicted. Some call him the first citizen. Others suggest he reduced Athens to monarchy in all but name. But here's the most fascinating archaeological discovery. Excavations in the Kerameikos Cemetery in 1998 uncovered mass graves from the plague period. Analysis of burial patterns reveals something unexpected: wealthy families and poor families buried together, all victims of the same policy. Pericles' strategy affected every class equally. He wasn't protecting elites, he was gambling with the entire city. Pericles himself contracts the plague in 429 BC. On his deathbed, surrounded by friends listing his military victories, he supposedly says something revealing: "You praise what fortune gave me. My greatest achievement is that no Athenian wore mourning because of me." But 30,000 Athenians had just died from plague while following his strategy. What did he mean? Some historians interpret this as evidence of genuine democratic commitment. He measured success not by conquests, but by whether he'd caused unjust suffering. Others see it as final self-justification, reframing catastrophic failure as moral victory. The truth may be more disturbing. Pericles had so successfully shaped Athenian consciousness that even in death, he controlled how his legacy would be interpreted. He'd made his worldview into their worldview. His vision had become indistinguishable from their own will. But what specific techniques did Pericles use that we've lost to history? After Athens' defeat in the Peloponnesian War in 404 BC, and especially after the rise of Macedonian power in the following century, much of Athens' governmental archives were lost or destroyed. Detailed records of assembly procedures, voting methodologies, and the informal networks that actually shaped policy gone. There are tantalizing hints in surviving sources. References to a practice called probuluma pre-deliberation by a council that shaped what the full assembly would consider. Descriptions of sophisticated voting procedures designed to prevent manipulation. Mentions of informal dinner clubs where real policy was decided before public debates even began. Some scholars believe certain aspects of Pericles' system were deliberately obscured. If democracy is supposed to be about equal participation, how do you preserve records that show it was actually guided by sophisticated elite management? The texts that survived emphasized Athens' democratic ideals. The mechanisms that made those ideals function in practice remain largely mysterious. Modern political scientists recognize concepts like agenda-setting theory and preference-shaping, but these were supposedly developed in the 20th century. What if Pericles understood these principles 2,400 years ago? What if the specific techniques were recorded but didn't survive because later generations found them too uncomfortable, too revealing of how democracy actually works versus how it's supposed to work? We know Pericles perfected something unprecedented. We know Athens under his leadership punched far above its weight, achieving cultural and political influence that still echoes today. But exactly how he did it remains partially hidden. So here's the question we should be asking: did Pericles perfect democracy or reveal its fundamental contradiction? Can genuine self-government exist when some people understand the system better than others? When some can shape opinions while others merely hold them? When leadership requires exactly the kind of expertise and vision that democracy is supposed to protect against? We live in societies that claim Athenian democracy as their ancestor. We celebrate citizen participation, equal votes, government by the people. But do we acknowledge that effective democracy might require the same sophisticated understanding Pericles possessed? That true democratic leadership might mean guiding without appearing to guide, empowering while actually directing. Perhaps the lost wisdom isn't just about ancient techniques. Perhaps it's about honestly confronting what democracy really requires to function and whether that's compatible with what we claim democracy means. What do you think? Can democracy survive true equality, or does it need its Pericles to function at all?